This is a bizarre case of a mother and a father who get their own attorney, who get their own spokespeople, who don't immediately begin to cooperate and talk with the police to try to find the killer. They wait.
Why don't the police just take them downtown and talk to them?
They were being targeted for John Benet's death.
I said, John, would you allow me to do some things that I think are necessary to do here? And I said, yes, absolutely.
Why did you decide you wanted to talk?
They had not yet really given any kind of substantive interviews with the police. And they're on national television talking about this case.
An FBI spokesman was quoted.
By now, though, the police were focusing almost entirely on the parents.
Well, there's been so much publicity saying the Ramseys wouldn't talk with police.
No, that's total fiction. We talked to him in the home.
There's this perception, it's the wrong perception, that the detectives really didn't look elsewhere.
But the one interview that police were really hoping for, John Benet's own parents, that was still on hold.
I want to say nothing negative about a family going through hell, but why the hell aren't they talking to the police? I just don't understand.
Do you see how even on a question as simple as did the Ramseys cooperate, were the Ramseys cooperating, there seem to be two narratives. In the same way that there's a narrative that John Benet was kidnapped and there was an intruder, there's also another narrative. Which narrative is true? And when we deal with the narrative of lawyering up, there's something similarly slippery there. Who did they lawyer up with? When? How? And what actually happened? That also is quite a fuzzy narrative. And then what begins to emerge out of this fuzziness is this question, was he a professional associate or a social friend? That's where we ended off on the previous episode, where John was asked this question. And John answered, he said, I guess Mike Bynum was more of a professional associate. And our very first introduction to Mike Bynum is him bringing food from Pastor Jay's to the Fernies. And if you didn't know, you would assume he was more a friend than a colleague. And he just happened to be a lawyer who just happened to stumble into the legalities. But what happens if we dig deeper? What happens if we ask,
What more than that?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Large enough for someone to crawl through. And toward the back of the basement, that storage room, where John Benet's body was found.
That individual who is chaperoning Diane Sawyer through the Ramsey home and also through the intruder theory happens to be Mike Bynum. Do you think he's doing that as his capacity as a friend, as a lawyer, or as even a corporate lawyer? And one of the questions we ended off, the first part on this peripheral figure, was the question, what strata would he belong in, meaning Mike Bynum? Would he be roughly in the same category as the Steins? And the answer was, And the interesting thing with the Steins were friends who later became colleagues. John Ramsey would later offer Glenn Stein, Doug Stein's father, a job, and the Steins would then follow the Ramseys to Atlanta. Of course, that is another story. In this analysis, I want to continue juxtaposing these two narratives, the narrative of cooperation and this idea that Mike Bynum was basically just a friend of theirs, with, I guess, another narrative, which is that the Ramseys lawyered up, and the idea, well, did they lawyer up with him? Did they lawyer up with someone else? Or did they lawyer up with him and other people? What's the true story in terms of that? And so we're going to go to the death of innocence to try to get a handle on how the Ramseys tell that story. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, and it has taken quite a lot of effort to research, please do hit the thanks button. If you've never hit the thanks button, please do so. And let's get started. So the death of innocence, John, I think, is writing about the afternoon and evening of December 27th. I did little more than struggle to keep from losing my mind. My body seemed to be running on automatic, even though barely. The press and the media were all over the place. Cameras were pointed at the windows. And you get this idea that they escaped the Boulder press, as I say, to leapfrog them in Atlanta with people that knew them. I'm not really sure if it's John or Patsy who's narrating it, but he or she says, I could see the reporters walking around outside talking to each other. The horde seemed like vultures, waiting to find tidbits of flesh to pounce on. Patsy and I were terrified for our safety, so I guess it is John that is narrating it. He says, we had no idea why this horrendous crime had been committed. While we were safely inside the Fernie's home with police protection, outside in the streets there was a killer who must be apprehended before he or she could strike us again. And 29 years later, that killer is still out there. When Mike Bynum returned the next day, I had a private conversation with him. Now, bear in mind, just above that, he's talking about the 27th of December. So when he says, when Mike Bynum returned the next day, is he talking about the 28th? But anyway, he says, I had a private conversation with him. He told me that it would be prudent for me to retain an attorney. And here you see John coming up with that familiar refrain. He says, I told Mike to do whatever he thought was right. It's a very general term. There's nothing about a contract. Like, what specific legal thing are we talking about? And that's something we would really want to see in black and white. What contracts were signed with which attorney, when, and how? And how was this brokered? With whom? He goes on to write, I still wasn't making sense of it all. Couldn't the police see what a loving family we were? How could they think otherwise? Except for a few speeding tickets. And so he's basically saying, just judge a book by its cover. Just look at us and you should be able to determine our innocence. And you almost get that idea that that's what they took to Atlanta. That's why they went into CNN, was to say, look at us, you can see what kind of people we are. And as a result of that, you should see that we're innocent. I'm not sure why that is so different to talking to the police. Isn't that another way that you can see what a loving family they are, by talking to them? I mean, isn't another way you demonstrate your loving family, that you love your daughter, by talking to the police about trying to help them find out, and also try and help yourself find out what had happened? Now, even here, John isn't explicit about hiring Bynum then and there, or about Bynum acting then and there as his legal counsel. It's almost like he's saying, will you go and see and organize legal counsel for me? And there is some truth to that, because at the end of the day, John got a lawyer, Patsy had a lawyer, Burke had a lawyer, even John's ex-wife got her own lawyer. Now, what I'm trying to show you is, just in terms of this sensitive question about when John lawyered up, the narrative is kind of confusing. It's kind of all over the place. It's kind of hinky, kind of like the ransom note. It should be short and precise. This is when it happened, and he's our lawyer. Suppose you could argue that, in a sense, Mike Bynum was John's lawyer anyway, and so when he said, just do what you think is necessary, he doesn't really need to formalize it. It's the client asking his counsel to take action. The interesting thing, though, is you seem to get the idea that, on the one hand, in some versions of events, there seems to be the lawyer suggesting that he will take it upon himself to do certain things, and then in others, what I'm getting at is this question of who decided whether to cooperate with the police. Whose responsibility was that? And that's another foggy, fuzzy area. Now, if we go to 2 pages earlier, the same vague language plays out, but this time it's referring to December 26th, and this is from The Death of Innocence. I could tell that Aunt didn't like my answer and she intended to persist. And it seems to be where he's basically saying, we wanted to answer their questions here at the Fernies, right? Basically, John is setting the pace, setting the tone, setting conditions, I guess. Mike Bynum, a good friend who had arrived earlier with food in hand, overheard Aunt insisting that we go down to the police station. So seems to be how the story is told, that Mike Bynum became aware of how the police felt about the whole situation. It seems that Mike basically arrives there just to do a goodwill gesture, and then he gets drawn into the whole thing. And I'm not sure whether that is accurate. I'm just saying that impression is created by having him arrive there with food, and then he overhears something. Whereas when he says something earlier on, and in the clip that I played to you earlier on, he seems to arrive at the house already informed that the Ramseys would be made targets. Isn't that how you understood it? Then Bynum immediately talked with our family pediatrician who had also come to support us. Now it's interesting that it's not the family doctor that's there, it's the doctor of John Bonet, and he's got some sensitive information about John Bonet. And the weird thing is you've got John there, the pediatrician there, and the lawyer there, and they are basically talking to one another. Dr. Francisco Buff told Mike that in his professional opinion, Patsy was in no condition to leave the house. So basically, they're making it absolutely clear that Patsy is not going to be talking to the police. And as we know, she then spoke to the media. She went onto CNN just something like 4 days later. When Mike related the message to the detectives, they continued to insist that we go downtown. So you can see that the police are basically putting pressure on the Ramseys. It's not as though they didn't know the protocol. They didn't know that it was necessary to, as soon as possible, sequestrate the Ramseys and question them. And John will also kind of bring this up and say they didn't seem to know this, that the police didn't seem to know what the proper protocols were. And didn't he say something like that on Crime Junkie? I seem to remember him saying that somewhere where he said, the police were amateurs, they didn't really know what was going on. Well, Ron Walker knew what the protocols were. Linda Arndt seemed to know what the protocols were. Fred Patterson seemed to know what the protocols were. Larry Mason seemed to know what the protocols were. And then John writes, Patsy and I desperately wanted to help solve this crime, but why couldn't they talk to us here in the privacy of this living room? Equally, you could say, why couldn't they just go downtown and get that over with? Mike had been a prosecutor for the district attorney's office in Boulder before becoming part of the largest law firm in town. Now, those are pretty impressive credentials. If you were the police and you were basically confronted by this guy and you found out that he's with the district attorney's office in Boulder, he's working for the largest law firm in town, wouldn't that kind of stop you in your tracks? And didn't it? This guy's not just a lawyer, he's a heavy hitter. The other part I want to emphasize is John doesn't mention here why Mike arrived with the food, or indeed why his friend Mike knew to find him at the furnace. That part's not really established in their book, The Death of Innocence. When Diane Sawyer asked Bynum how he heard about John Bonet on the 26th, right? Yes, she actually deals with this question. It's also strangely foggy. Look at this. Sawyer, December 26th, how did you hear that something had happened? Bynum, I had been snowshoeing with my family and friends, and we were, and then it sort of trails off. Sawyer says, when Bynum, who had lost an infant grandchild of his own, learned that John Bonet had been murdered, he rushed to a friend's house, where the Ramseys and their 9-year-old son had gone to stay. Can you tell me about what you saw when you walked in that door? Can you see that the question has been asked, but it's not really been answered here? Certainly not in this transcript. Do you notice he doesn't actually answer the question? How did he hear? How did he know where the Ramseys were? Meanwhile, Schiller notes that Bynum overhears Arndt insisting the Ramseys come into the station. This was on the 26th. And then, based on doctor's orders, Mike advises John and I think the detectives. And so now it becomes even muddier. Is this because of a health situation, or is it legal advice, or what's going on? So it comes back to this question, is Mike Bynum being a friend here, a lawyer, or both? Which is it? John also points out that Mike is a former prosecutor for Boulder's DA's office. Now think about it in those terms. Just hours after John Bonet is found dead, a lawyer that used to work for the DA's office is bringing the Ramseys pizza, or whatever it was, while telling the cops to back off. He also describes his pal as working for the largest law firm in town.
On the 3rd floor.
So now we're going down the stairs toward John Bonet's room. So this is like a little storage area, sort of. And this is John Bonet's room.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Let's go back to Diane Sawyer speaking to Mike Bynum. Why did they get a lawyer, Bynum? I went as their friend to help. Now, think about those words. He says, I went as their friend to help, but he got a call from, as he said, someone who was in law enforcement, and didn't he say he thought they were being targeted by the police? So is it accurate to say that, or is it kind of a bit of both? Well, I think he says that in the next part. He says, I felt that they should have legal advice, nothing more, nothing less. So can you see there's sort of a two-sided coin here? He's their friend, and then he says, I felt that they should have legal advice, nothing more, nothing less. Well, I mean, he also brought food, so there is something more than that going on. We also know, in terms of that nothing more, nothing less, that he spoke to the doctor, and the doctor said, Patsy's in no condition. So it wasn't just legal advice, it was, I don't know what you want to call it, just that there's this strange boundary where some of it's like 50% I'm acting as a friend, and 50% I'm acting as someone who's giving legal advice. And one wonders why there's all of this narrative stuff going on, because is it so that you can't say on the day that JonBenét was found, well, literally hours after she was found, JonBenét was getting advice from a lawyer? No, because he was actually getting advice from a friend who just happened to be a lawyer. I do think no matter what we think and what our opinions are, one's got to look at what their own words say on the subject. And so when Sawyer says, so you're the reason they got a lawyer, Bynum says, I'm the one. But what does that mean? Does he mean I'm the one who got them lawyers, or I'm the lawyer that got them lawyers, or I was the first lawyer? Anyway, Sawyer says, it did not occur to them first, meaning to get a lawyer, Bynum. They certainly never made any mention of it to me. Sawyer, I'm trying to imagine if I'm in the middle of this agony and my friend says to me, you better get a lawyer. I think I'd go, what? Bynum. Well, Sawyer, this horrible thing has happened to my child. There's a note there. I should get a lawyer? Bynum. Well, first of all, that was not the words that I used. I told John there were some legal issues that I thought needed to be taken care of. Are those the words that John uses? Doesn't John just say something about there's some things I can do for you? I don't think he says, are there some legal things I can do for you? Because legal issues is something that you would need a lawyer to do, someone in someone's capacity as a lawyer. Anyway, he says, John just looked at me and said, do whatever you think needs to be done. And he and Burke went into a room to talk with Burke, and so did I. Now, I'm not quite sure what that refers to. Is that Burke Ramsey or Patrick Burke? I don't know. Sawyer, what made you think there were legal issues? Bynum, I was a prosecutor. I know how this works. I know where the police's attention's going to go right from the get-go. Now, on the one hand, I think it makes sense to say Patsy, it wasn't a good time for Patsy to be interviewed, but why couldn't John have been interviewed then and there? That's one way of sequestrating them. Interview John first. I think the only problem with that is if you interview them at different times, then the one can consult with the other. What you really want to do is interview them at the same time separately and then compare their statements. But I think in all of this narrative fuzziness, the rabbit hole goes a little deeper, because Bynum, as it turns out, wasn't just a lawyer or a friend. He was John Ramsey's corporate lawyer. And what corporate are we talking about here? Well, nothing less than Access Graphics, a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. And Schiller will tell you what Bynum's specialities in law actually were. Bynum also got his law degree at Colorado University and worked briefly as a deputy DA in Boulder before becoming, this is important, becoming a specialist in business planning, acquisitions, and commercial transactions. Now, a year from this point, John Ramsey would sell Access Graphics, or basically Lockheed would dispose of Access Graphics to General Electric in a transaction that would be valued at $2.8 billion. And it's interesting that in the very first lines of the ransom note, there's this reference to, we respect your business, but not the country that it serves. And of course, business is spelled incorrectly. But think of it from a totally different angle here. Bynum is a corporate lawyer. And what do you think Lockheed Martin are going to think about someone who's their vice president being possibly implicated, someone who's possibly going to get a lot of bad press, which could affect them? And is that going to have some kind of impact on some of the mergers and acquisitions, some of the things that they want to dispose of. And so was there some kind of commercial interest in making sure that the legal aspect to the case was handled properly? Because that's a narrative we almost never talk about and almost never hear about. And maybe if Bynum is pitching up there as a friend, then that narrative is totally irrelevant. He is there just to offer some advice. He's not there in any other capacity. Now we navigate to the third page of From the Death of Innocence, or is that a third paragraph of fluff to get to the point about when and where and if they lawyered up on December 26th. John says, I felt distraught. Sure, Patsy and I desperately wanted to help solve this crime, but why couldn't they talk to us here in the privacy of this living room? I think one of the reasons they didn't want to do that was because there would be kind of noise and interruptions, and it would probably end up being a shorter interview than it needed to be. And also the police didn't have all the resources they would have at the police station, other detectives behind the scenes recording everything and all that kind of thing. And so he says, John, I have to level with you. I know this is going to sound strange, but right now you and Patsy are in no condition to make any decisions. So that even refers to John. So it's actually like Mike is saying, I'm taking charge here. You guys aren't going to talk to the police. Would you give me permission to make some choices for you and do what needs to be done? Now that is slightly different in the book to what Mike says to Diane Sawyer, where he says, I told John there were some legal issues that I thought needed to be taken care of. And I think what needs to be asked there really is, what legal issues specifically are you talking about? Then coming back to the death of innocence, Mike marched out of the room and confronted the two detectives, telling them there would be no interviews at the police station. Under medical advice, John and Patsy, and there you have it. So basically it is the lawyer who basically makes the decision and basically says, after John says, do whatever you think should be done. So it's kind of the lawyer's responsibility, the lawyer taking responsibility and saying there will be no interviews at the police station. And I think this is where you ask the question, were the Ramseys cooperating? And this is where you can say, well, they wanted to, but a lawyer told them not to. Technically true, but in the whole sort of general thing of the investigation, in terms of any case, was this a case where the police wanted information, wanted something to happen, and did the people that they wanted to talk to cooperate with them? And you can say, yes, they did, but a lawyer wouldn't let them. But at the end of the day, that comes down to they are not cooperating. They are not talking to the police, and the police do need to talk to them. And if the issue is health and Patsy's psychology, I don't know if you can say that that needed to be the case for 4 months. So it took 4 months for Patsy's to calm down in order to talk to the police. So would you agree when I say Bynum is clearly acting like a lawyer here? He seems to be representing John and Patsy's rights, but this is also being conflated with medical advice. And at the same time, this idea that Bynum is a lawyer, but is also a friend. He's a friend who's a lawyer. So I guess you could say the friend told the police to back off. Do you think that the police saw Bynum as a friend, as a doctor, or as a lawyer? It's arguably like the ransom note. Is the ransom note a ransom note? Was the kidnapping a kidnapping? Is this lawyering up or not? Another caveat to all of this is highlighted by Schiller when he writes, without consulting John or Patsy, Bynum told Detective Arndt that the Ramseys would not give any more testimonial evidence without a criminal attorney present. And as soon as you say that without consulting John or Patsy, it doesn't become technically John or Patsy's responsibility. It's the lawyer's responsibility if you know that he's the lawyer. If you don't know he's the lawyer, then it becomes this wash. If you question that and you say, but didn't he just consult John and Patsy and say, can I take some legal steps on your behalf? No, that was just a casual conversation. So do you see what I'm getting at? Everything is so fuzzy. And doesn't it seem to be an interesting inclusion? So a lawyer tells the detective something, but without consulting John and Patsy. Otherwise, of course, they would have given interviews. There's something else I want to mention. On January 1st, less than a week later, when the Ramseys went on CNN, The second question they were asked by the host was about lawyering up so quickly, and we'll deal with that in the next episode. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I would like to hear your views. Do you think I'm being too harsh? Do you think that I'm misunderstanding this? It's possible that I am. Or do you think there is something to this fuzziness around the narrative? I'd be interested to hear your opinion. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.